Story 1. I'm Ethan Carter, and I work the night shift at the Burger King, located at 4901 Westheimer Ard, Houston, Texas. It's a bustling part of the city, but my shifts are typically quiet. That was until one particularly unsettling night when everything changed. The night started like any other. The clock ticked past midnight, and the restaurant was winding down. I was busy cleaning up and preparing for the last few orders of the night when the phone rang. It was an unusual hour for a delivery request, but I answered it nonetheless. Caller requested a late-night delivery of several burgers and fries. This wasn't common for our location, especially not at this hour, but I took the order and got everything ready. Just as I was about to leave for the delivery, a car pulled up to the drive-thru. The driver, a man I didn't recognize, casually picked up the order I had prepared. He didn't say a word or even acknowledge me as he drove off. It struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just another customer who preferred to pick up at a strange hour. I went back inside and continued my shift, trying to shake off the weird feeling that lingered. Hours later, just before the clock struck 2 a.m., I received another call from the same number. The caller claimed their order hadn't arrived and was irate about the delay. I was confused and frustrated. I had already delivered the food. I tried to reason with the caller, but they were insistent and demanded a refund. Determined to resolve the issue, I went to check the storage room where I had left the delivery bag earlier. To my horror, the bag was still there. Food was untouched, as if no one had ever taken it. My heart started racing, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Had I made a mistake? I double-checked the records, but everything seemed correct. There was no sign of an error or confusion. I decided to investigate further. I checked the phone records and the delivery system. Everything seemed normal. There was no indication that a delivery order had been placed, let alone that it was not fulfilled. I even reached out to my manager, Linda Johnson, who was equally puzzled. She suggested I go home and rest, as the situation seemed to be getting to me. Reluctantly, I left for the night, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that lingered. But my peace was short-lived. The following night, the same unsettling events unfolded. The moment I walked into the restaurant, I received another delivery call. This time, I was determined to stay and keep an eye on things. I locked the doors and stayed in the restaurant, waiting for the customer to arrive. As I waited, I began to hear unsettling noises, the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the empty restaurant, distant whispers, and the occasional creak of the old floors. It was as if the building itself was alive, watching me. The noises grew louder and more persistent. I grabbed a broom for protection, hoping it would help me detect any intruders. I heard knocking, loud, insistent knocking, coming from various parts of the building. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could hardly breathe. I searched the restaurant, but found nothing out of the ordinary. As the knocking grew more intense, I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I couldn't understand what was happening. The knocking turned into a cacophony of sound, echoing through the empty restaurant. I finally collapsed in a corner, overwhelmed by fear and exhaustion. When I regained consciousness, I found myself alone in the darkened restaurant. My colleagues and manager found me the next morning. They were concerned and confused by my state. I tried to explain what had happened, the strange phone calls, the delivery that never went through, and the eerie noises, but they were skeptical. They said the restaurant had been closed after midnight, and all phone lines had been shut off. It was impossible for any delivery order to have come through. Linda and the others suggested I might have been hallucinating or experiencing some sort of breakdown. They admitted me to a hospital for evaluation. Doctors thought I was suffering from severe stress or a mental health crisis, but I knew what I had experienced was real. I did some research during my time in the hospital and uncovered a chilling piece of history about our Burger King location. Before it became a fast food restaurant, the site had been the scene of a tragic accident. Several years ago, a truck crashed into the building, killing 4 people. The accident was so severe that it led to significant structural damage and the deaths of several employees and patrons. Since the incident, strange occurrences had been reported by previous employees. Reports of unexplained noises, sightings of shadowy figures, and a pervasive sense of dread were common. It seemed that the spirits of those who had perished in the accident were still lingering in the building, unable to move on. I returned to work eventually, but the events of that night had left a lasting impact on me. Phone calls, the strange deliveries, and the unsettling noises were all part of something far more sinister than I could have imagined. Each night shift became a test of courage and sanity as I worked in the shadow of the past. Burger King on Westheimer RD remains a place of mystery and fear. I know now that the building holds more than just the memories of its past. It harbors the restless spirits of those who met a tragic end. And every so often, they reach out to those who are unfortunate enough to be there during the witching hours. So if you ever find yourself at that Burger King late at night, remember my story. The past has a way of coming back to haunt us, and sometimes the shadows of history are far more real than we'd like to believe. Story 2. I've always valued my independence. After years of hard work and saving, I finally had the means to move my elderly father, Henry, into a place of our own. His health had been declining steadily, and I knew finding a home suitable for both of us, especially one that accommodated his wheelchair, would be a challenge. But when I came across a listing for a quaint old house in a quiet neighborhood in Salem, Massachusetts, I thought I'd finally found the perfect place. The house had character, that much was clear. Built in the early 1900s, it had a large porch with intricate woodwork, tall windows, and a sense of history that immediately drew me in. The rent was surprisingly affordable, almost too good to be true. But the landlord, a man named Mr. Lawrence Price, assured me it was because the house needed some minor repairs. There's nothing that would affect your daily living, Mr. Price had said, smiling in a way that never quite reached his eyes. He was in his late 60s, with thinning gray hair, a lean frame, and a peculiar habit of always keeping his hands in his pocket. Just a few creaky floorboards and a bit of peeling paint here and there. I'd fix it myself, but well, you know how it is. I didn't, but I nodded anyway, eager to move in and get settled. The house's layout was strange. Narrow hallways, oddly shaped rooms, but it was nothing I couldn't manage. Plus, first floor was entirely wheelchair accessible, which was a rare find. After a quick walkthrough, I signed the lease, a mix of excitement and apprehension bubbling inside me. Mr. Price was overly eager to close the deal, rushing through the paperwork with an urgency that felt off. But I brushed off my unease, chalking it up to nerves about the big move. First few days in the house were uneventful. I busied myself with unpacking, arranging furniture, and making the place feel like home. My dad, though frail, seemed to enjoy the change of scenery. He spent his days in the sunroom, a small, cozy space at the back of the house that overlooked a neglected but still beautiful garden. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to notice things that didn't sit right. I'd come home from work to find items slightly out of place. Dad's blanket folded differently, a book I'd been reading on the coffee table instead of the shelf. At first, I dismissed it as my own forgetfulness. Moving was stressful, and I had a lot on my mind. Then there were the noises. I knew old houses creak, but this was different. Late at night, I'd hear footsteps above my bedroom, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking from room to room. But when I'd go upstairs to check, the rooms would be empty, and Dad would be fast asleep in his bed. I mentioned it to Mr. Price one day when he came by to pick up the rent. He listened with that same peculiar smile and assured me it was just the house settling. "Nothing to worry about," he said, hands still deep in his pockets. "Old houses like this have their quirks. You'll get used to it." I wasn't so sure. There was something about the way Mr. Price lingered in the house. His eyes darting around as if he was searching for something made my skin crawl. I felt relieved when he finally left, though the relief was always short-lived. Every time he visited, the uneasy feeling in my gut grew stronger. One Friday, I left work early, hoping to surprise my dad with his favorite meal from the local diner. As I approached the house, I noticed something odd. Mr. Price's old, rusted car was parked in the driveway. My heart skipped a beat. He hadn't mentioned coming by today, and I hadn't given him permission to enter the house while I was out. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was silent, but I could sense someone had been there recently. A faint smell of aftershave, one I'd come to associate with Mr. Price, hung in the air. I moved quietly, my breath shallow, as I walked down the hallway toward my father's room. The door was ajar, and I pushed it open slowly. Dad was asleep in his bed, undisturbed, but something felt wrong. The air in the room was thicker, heavier. Then I heard it, a faint sound of shuffling footsteps coming from the direction of my bedroom. My heart pounded as I crept down the hall, my mind racing with thoughts of what I might find. When I reached my bedroom door, I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. There, standing by my dresser, was Mr. Price. He was rifling through my drawers, his back turned to me. The sight of him going through my personal belongings sent a surge of anger and fear through me. "What the hell are you doing?" My voice was sharp, louder than I intended. Mr. Price jumped, clearly startled. He turned around quickly, his face a mix of guilt and surprise. "Oh, Miss Thompson, I didn't expect you home so early." "That much is obvious," I shot back, my hands trembling. "Why are you in my room? What are you doing with my things?" He fumbled for words, his usual calm demeanor shattered. I was just checking on the repairs, making sure everything was in order." My eyes narrowed. "In my bedroom? Going through my drawers?" Mr. Price opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he shoved his hands back into his pockets and brushed past me, making his way to the front door. "I apologize, Miss Thompson. This won't happen again," he muttered before quickly exiting the house. I stood there, my mind reeling. I felt violated, my privacy shattered. It was one thing for Mr. Price to be odd, but this was something else entirely. I debated calling the police, but what would I say? The landlord was in the house he owned? Had he stolen anything? I wasn't even sure. But the incident left me on edge. I started locking my bedroom door at night, took to carrying a small can of pepper spray. Even inside my own home, the feeling of safety I'd once cherished in this house was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. Days passed, and though Mr. Price stayed away, it couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I noticed small things: curtains slightly askew, faint footprint in the dust on the attic stairs, a door I was certain I'd closed now slightly ajar. I tried talking to Dad about it, but he was in no state to understand. His health was deteriorating rapidly, and he seemed oblivious to the strange happenings in the house. I felt more alone than ever. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. But this time, they weren't coming from upstairs. They were right outside my bedroom door. My heart raced as I reached for the pepper spray on my nightstand. I strained to listen, my breath caught in my throat. Footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the doorknob turned slowly. My grip tightened on the can of pepper spray. I was ready to fight, but the door remained closed. Footsteps retreated, and I heard the faint sound of the front door creaking open, then closing again. I stayed up the rest of the night, my nerves frayed, every sound amplified in the quiet darkness. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I couldn't stay here. I needed to find another place, somewhere safe, even if it meant moving far away from the city I'd grown to love. Finding a new place wasn't easy. The housing market in Salem was competitive, and finding something both affordable and wheelchair accessible felt impossible. Every time I thought I'd found a suitable place, something would fall through. It was as if I was trapped in that old house, with no way out. Meanwhile, Mr. Price's behavior grew more erratic. He'd show up unannounced, offering flimsy excuses for his visits. Sometimes he'd just stand in the doorway, staring at me with that unnerving smile, his hands firmly in his pocket. I began to suspect that Mr. Price was more than just a creepy landlord. There was something about him that didn't add up, something that made me believe he was hiding something. I started researching the history of the house and discovered it had a dark past. Several previous tenants had moved out under mysterious circumstances, and there were rumors of strange happenings in the house, dating back decades. Final straw came one evening when I returned home to find my father's wheelchair at the bottom of the stairs, tipped over as if someone had tried to push him down. Dad was unharmed, still sitting in the sunroom, but the sight of the overturned wheelchair sent a chill down my spine. I confronted Mr. Price the next time he came by, demanding answers, but he just smiled that same eerie smile and said, "This house has been in my family for generations, Miss Thompson. Sometimes it likes to keep its tenants close." Terrified, I didn't know what to do. I felt like the walls of the house were closing in on me, and the once cozy atmosphere had turned into something sinister. I knew I had to get out, but with my father's condition and the difficulty of finding new housing, I felt trapped. Following night, I made up my mind to confront Mr. Price once and for all. Couldn't live in constant fear, wondering if he'd break in again or do something worse. As I lay in bed, trying to muster the courage to confront him, I heard the familiar sound of footsteps. This time, they were more deliberate, heavier, and they were coming straight toward my room. I held my breath, clutching the pepper spray, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The doorknob jiggled again. This time, it didn't stop. Door slowly creaked open, revealing the dark silhouette of Mr. Price standing in the doorway. "Miss Thompson," he whispered, voice low and menacing. "You're not planning on leaving us, are you?" I froze, unable to speak. His figure loomed in the doorway, blocking any chance of escape. His eyes gleamed with something dark and unnatural, a look that sent shivers down my spine. It was as if he had finally dropped all pretenses, revealing the true nature of his intentions. I'm moving out," I stammered, trying to sound firm despite the fear coursing through me. "You need to leave, now." Mr. Price took a step closer, his presence filling the room with an oppressive weight. "This house doesn't like it when people leave," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You belong here, Miss Thompson. You and your father. The house wants you to stay." Before I could react, he lunged at me. I sprayed the pepper spray directly into his face, and he let out a guttural scream, clutching his eyes. I took the chance to push past him, running down the hallway as fast as I could. I grabbed my father from his bed, my hands trembling as I strapped him into his wheelchair, and we made our way toward the front door. But just as we reached the door, it slammed shut with a force that shook the entire house. The windows rattled, and the lights flickered ominously. The house itself seemed to be alive, conspiring to keep us inside. "Let us out," I screamed, frantically trying to unlock the door. The key wouldn't turn. The house was fighting back, resisting our every effort to escape. I heard Mr. Price stumbling down the hallway behind us, breathing ragged, still reeling from the pepper spray. "You can't leave," he snarled. "The house won't let you." Desperation clawed at me as I realized there was only one option left. I turned and wheeled my father back into the house, heading toward the kitchen, where I knew there was a back door. The house groaned in protest, the walls seeming to close in as we raced toward our only hope of escape. Just as we reached the kitchen, the back door flew open, as if the house itself had finally given up its fight. I pushed my father out into the night air, my heart racing, and we made our way down the driveway as fast as we could. Behind us, the house loomed like a dark sentinel, its windows watching us with malevolent intent. I didn't stop until we were well away from the house, panting and terrified. Only then did I allow myself to look back. The house stood there in the darkness, silent and still. I could feel its presence, like it was waiting for us to return. I called the police that night, telling them everything. Mr. Price's invasion of our privacy, his attempts to keep us trapped in the house, and the strange occurrences that had plagued us since we moved in. But when the police arrived, Mr. Price was nowhere to be found. The house was empty, eerily quiet, as if nothing had happened. The officers searched the house thoroughly, but there was no sign of Mr. Price. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The only evidence that something was amiss was the overturned wheelchair and the unsettling feeling that lingered in the air. The police advised me to leave the house immediately, and I didn't need to be told twice. We spent the night in a nearby motel, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something far worse than we realized. The next day, I made arrangements to move out, determined to put the entire ordeal behind us. I found a small, accessible apartment on the other side of town, far away from the old house and its haunting presence. As we left Salem behind, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But there was also a nagging sense of unease. question that I couldn't answer. What had happened to Mr. Price? And why had the house seemed so determined to keep us there? Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. My father's health stabilized, and we settled into our new home. But every now and then, I would catch myself thinking about the old house and the strange events that had unfolded there. I would wonder if the house still stood, waiting for its next tenants, or if it had finally claimed what it wanted. Then one day, I received a letter in the mail. It was from a law firm in Salem, informing me that Mr. Lawrence Price had passed away under mysterious circumstances. His body had been found in the old house, locked in the attic. The cause of death was undetermined, but the letter stated that he had left a strange will, one that named me and my father as the sole inheritors of the house. The letter ended with a chilling note. "The house is yours, Miss Thompson. It's waiting for you." I stared at the letter, my hands trembling. The old fear crept back into my mind, and I knew, without a doubt, that I would never set foot in that house again. Whatever it was that haunted that place, whatever darkness resided within its walls, I wanted no part of it. I tore up the letter and threw it away, vowing to leave the past behind. But deep down, I knew that the house would always be a part of me, a shadow that would never fully disappear. And sometimes, late at night, I would dream of that old house in Salem. I would hear the footsteps in the hallway, creak of the floorboards, and the whisper of a voice that seemed to come from the very walls. In those dreams, the house was always the same, dark, foreboding, and waiting for me to come home. Destroy 3. My name is Alex Rivers, and I've always found solace in Victorian architecture. There's something about the grandeur and charm of these old homes that makes me feel at ease. But when my relationship fell apart, I was left searching for a new place to live. I found a room for rent in a large Victorian-style home at 123 Elm Street, a house with a history as old as its creaky floors. The room itself was spacious, with high ceilings and intricate moldings that hinted at the house's former glory. I thought the change of scenery would help me recover from the breakup and give me a fresh start. Little did I know that the old house had other plans for me. It started subtly. Late one night, as I lay in bed, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. I brushed it off as the house settling, or perhaps my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, the lights began to flicker, an unsettling strobe effect that was neither consistent nor explainable. I tried to ignore it, attributing it to old wiring or electrical issues. The house seemed to react to my emotions. On particularly rough days, the creaks and groans of the house became louder and more frequent. It was as if the walls themselves were responding to my distress. I began to feel a heavy presence, as if someone or something was watching me, even when I was alone. Determined to protect myself, I installed additional locks on all the doors and windows. I even invested in a small security camera system, hoping to capture any disturbances and provide some reassurance. But the sense of being watched persisted. I often caught glimpses of shadows moving out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there when I looked directly. One evening, as I was returning from work, I found a note slipped under my door. It was written in an unfamiliar handwriting and read, "You are not alone here." My heart raced as I scanned the room, but there was no one in sight. I checked the locks and found everything secure. The note felt like a cruel joke, but it only added to my growing anxiety. The noises continued, whispers, scratching sounds from the walls, and even the occasional door slamming shut on its own. I consulted with my landlord, Mr. Thompson, who was an elderly man with a stoic demeanor. He assured me that the house had a history, but there were no records of any supernatural occurrences. He suggested that the sounds might be due to old plumbing or shifting foundations. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I researched the history of the house and discovered that it had been built in the late 1800s. There were several stories about its previous occupants, some of whom had faced mysterious and tragic ends. The more I learned, the more I felt connected to the house's unsettling past. One night, while trying to sleep, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. I rushed to the source of the noise, my closet, only to find that nothing had fallen or broken. My anxiety grew, and I started to fear the house itself. I felt trapped, unable to escape the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to seep into every corner. Final straw came when I woke up one morning to find that the locks I had installed were broken. Security cameras showed nothing but static, as if someone or something had tampered with them. I was terrified. The idea of staying in the house became unbearable. I decided to move out. It was a difficult decision, but I knew it was the only way to regain my peace of mind. As I packed my belongings, I took one last look around the house. The flickering lights and faint whispers seemed to intensify, almost as if the house was protesting my departure. Leaving Elm Street felt like stepping out of a nightmare. As I drove away, I glanced back at the Victorian home. It stood there, majestic and foreboding, a silent witness to the unsettling experiences that had unfolded within its walls. I could only hope that the next tenant would find a way to coexist with the house's eerie presence, perhaps find peace that had eluded me. The house at 123 Elm Street remains a testament to the mysteries of the past and the unsettling experiences that can linger long after the previous occupants have moved on. If you ever find yourself in need of a place to stay and come across a Victorian gem with a hidden history, remember my story. Sometimes, the charm of an old house can be more than just aesthetic, it can be a gateway to something far more unsettling. My name is Jessica Collins, and I was a college student trying to make some extra cash by working for DoorDash. Most of my deliveries were routine, quick drop-offs at apartments or houses in well-lit areas. But one night, I got a request that would haunt me for years to come. It was around midnight when I received an order for a delivery. The customer's address was in a part of town I wasn't familiar with, a dark, abandoned area that seemed to have been forgotten by time. Despite the eerie surroundings, I accepted the job. The extra money was too tempting, and I was determined to finish my shift without any issues. As I drove through the deserted streets, the darkness seemed to close in around me. The occasional streetlight cast long shadows, and the old buildings loomed like silent giants. When I arrived at the address, I saw that the house was old and decrepit, its windows boarded up with rotting wood. I felt a shiver run down my spine, tried to shake it off. I had made deliveries to questionable places before. This wasn't going to be any different. I called the customer to confirm the delivery. The phone rang several times before someone picked up. To my horror, I overheard a disturbing conversation between a woman with a high-pitched, almost mocking voice and another person who was clearly in distress. Conversation was fragmented and hard to understand, but I made out enough to know that the woman was taunting the other person, who was begging for help. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, unable to hang up the phone. Fearful for my safety, I decided to leave the delivery at the doorstep and get out of there as quickly as possible. I placed the food on the porch and sped back to my car. My hands were shaking as I drove away, and my mind raced with what I had just heard. I called the police to report the unsettling conversation, but when they arrived at the address, they found nothing unusual. The house was abandoned, and the street was eerily silent, as if nothing had ever happened. The police told me that there were no signs of recent activity or anyone living in the house. They suggested that I might have misinterpreted the conversation, or that it was a prank call. I was frustrated and frightened. My gut told me something was terribly wrong, but the authorities couldn't find any evidence to support my fears. The experience left me shaken. I could no longer ignore the gnawing feeling of dread that had settled in my stomach. The image of that dark, abandoned neighborhood haunted my thoughts, and the voice on the other end of the phone echoed in my mind. I found it impossible to shake the feeling that something sinister was lurking in that house. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to do night deliveries anymore. The thought of returning to that creepy part of town was too distressing. The whole ordeal made me question the safety of late-night gigs and left me with a deep-seated fear of dark, isolated places. To this day, I avoid working late shifts and avoid neighborhoods that give me the same uneasy feeling. The memory of that delivery serves as a grim reminder of how unsettling a seemingly simple job can become. Sometimes, the creepiest experiences aren't the ones you can see, but the ones that leave a lingering sense of dread long after you've left.